بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد الصادق الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين وبعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, we are here again covering al-Arba'un al-Nawawiyya, the 40 hadith compilation of al-Imam al-Nawawi. And today we're going to cover a single hadith, hadith number 32. And this hadith, we'll read it in Arabic and look at the meaning in English. Imam al-Nawawi transmits عن أبي سعيد سعد ibn Malik ibn Sinan al-Khudri رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال لا ضرر ولا ضرار. حديث حسن رواه ابن ماجه والدارقطني وغيرهما مسندا، ورواه مالك في الموطأ عن عمرو بن يحيى عن أبيه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم مرسلا، فأسقط أبا سعيد وله طرق يقوي بعضها بعضا. Alhamdulillah, this hadith is very short, but the meaning is incredibly deep and far-reaching. This comes from the companion Abu Sa'id, Sa'ad ibn Malik ibn Sinan al-Khudri radiyallahu anhu, and he relates that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, "La darar wa la dirar." There is to be no harm or reciprocating harm. There is to be no harm or reciprocating harm. Imam al-Nawawi, after citing this hadith, says that this is a Hasan hadith, it's a sound hadith, recorded by Ibn Majah and al-Daraqutni and others with a complete chain back to the Prophet ﷺ. It was also related by Imam Malik in his Muwatta with a chain missing the name of the companion from Amr bin Yahya, from his father, from the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Sa'id is dropped from that chain, Imam Nawawi says, though it has other chains of transmission that strengthen it and corroborate it. This hadith, as brief as it is, contains so much of the rulings of Islam in it. This hadith has one of the most important principles of our deen, and it encompasses nearly every aspect of our fiqh, our legal system. The narrator of this hadith, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiyallahu anhu, was from the Khazraj people of Medina, and he was one of the ulama among the companions, one of the most knowledgeable among them. He died in the year 64 after Hijrah in Medina and transmits 1,170 hadith. So this hadith, let's start from the beginning, looking at the basic meaning and then looking at it as it becomes a legal maxim that applies to so many areas of our law. This hadith is presented, linguistically at least, as a statement of fact. The Prophet ﷺ says, "La darar wa la dirar." According to the very basic literal reading of that hadith, it would be translated as, there is no harm and there is no reciprocating harm. However, we understand from this hadith that it's actually a prohibition and not a statement of fact. Because we see here that an indefinite noun is used with a negation. And in the Arabic language, an indefinite noun, when used in the context of negation, indicates complete generality and encompassment. And the ulama mentioned that this hadith encompasses all forms of harm, and it means that the default ruling of all things harmful is that they are unlawful, they are haram. And the meaning of the hadith then becomes, there is to be no harm and there is to be no reciprocating harm. Based on this hadith, the ulama deduce that the default ruling of all things that are harmful is that they are unlawful, and they do not become allowed unless there is an external proof indicating that there is something that would allow it, that excludes it from this principle of prohibiting harm. Imam Ibn Abdul Barr, one of the great Maliki scholars, he wrote in his commentary on the Muwatta, when he comments on this hadith, he says that the word darar means to harm someone else, and dirar is to respond to harm done to you in a way that is unlawful. The hadith uses two words that both come from the same root letters, darar and dirar. The difference between them, according to Imam Ibn Abdul Barr, is that darar is for a person to initiate harm, and dirar is for a person to respond to harm by doing something harmful that is unlawful and beyond the bounds of the Sharia. This is the basic meaning. This hadith is a very, very important hadith, especially to jurists, to fuqaha, because it is the basis of a legal maxim, a legal principle, a qa'ida fiqhiyya that governs many, many areas of the Sharia. So we want to talk about legal maxims a little bit here and see how this hadith serves as a legal maxim applied to many different cases in real life. First of all, what is a legal maxim? A legal maxim, what we call a qa'ida fiqhiyya, is a preponderant principle or a general guideline or rule of thumb that is supposed to help the jurist in determining the legal rulings in various issues. That's your basic definition of a legal maxim. A legal maxim is not a ruling. It is a rule of thumb. It is a guiding principle that assists the jurist in arriving at the correct conclusion in a question of Islamic law. It's preponderant. It is predominant, meaning there will be some exceptions to these principles in certain cases because of other conflicting proofs, but we know from these principles that they apply to most issues. Why are maxims important? In the Islamic legal tradition, maxims are very important because it's nearly impossible for a scholar to know and retain every single fiqh issue. When we look in the books of fiqh, the multi-volumed works of Islamic law, there are thousands and thousands of legal rulings, and it is incredibly difficult for a faqih, a jurist, to retain and have on hand all of those thousands and thousands of rulings at the same time. So the legal maxim is a way of helping them bring issues to these principles. It shortens the time required by a scholar to research an issue, because if they need to deliver a ruling, if the question is conveyed accurately and they understand it, and they see it fits under this general principle, they don't need a specific proof to give the ruling about that issue when it fits under that legal maxim. So it's a way of assisting the jurist in finding the answers to pressing questions. And another reason why it's important to know legal maxims for the jurist is that sometimes rulings will conflict with one another. Sometimes there will be rulings that seem to clash. And the job of the faqih is not to throw one out and keep the other. The job of the faqih, when he can, is to reconcile between the two. And one of the ways you can reconcile between rulings is to revert to the qawa'id fiqhiyya, the legal maxims, to help distinguish which one gets precedence, which one preponderates over the other, and how do you deliver a ruling that is accurate according to the legal maxims. Legal maxims are important even for non-jurists, even for non-scholars such as ourselves. It's important to know legal maxims because they help us have Islamic literacy, to have a broader understanding of the overarching principles of Islam and the objectives of the Sharia. When it comes to the lay Muslim, the average everyday Muslim, he or she doesn't have to know all of these legal maxims. Many of them are very, very detailed, and require a background Sharia knowledge. There's certain case precedents and principles that require a background in fiqh to understand them. However, there are certain maxims that are universal. They are universal maxims, and those should be known by every single Muslim. So these maxims that we're talking about, where do we get them from? Are they just made up on the spot, or are they derived from sources? They are, of course, derived. They are derived first and foremost from the Quran, and then they are derived from the prophetic statements, the ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And thirdly, they are derived from the ijtihad, the independent legal reasoning of properly qualified Islamic scholars. This process of the mujtahid deriving maxims is called istiqra, or inductive reading, where the mujtahid, because of his or her mastery of the primary sources of Sharia, is able to do an inductive, comprehensive reading of the vast corpus of Islamic law. And from that vast reading, he or she is able to determine and develop these legal maxims, these principles that derive from the primary sources or derive from the ijma' or the qiyas or the legal verdicts of companions, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of depth to this. And looking at the sources, we also want to understand that there are different types of maxims, as I just alluded to. We said that the lay person doesn't have to know all of these maxims, nor should they really try to until they've learned some measure of Sharia in a formal setting. However, there are some maxims that every Muslim should know so that they have proper Islamic literacy. What are the types of maxims? Number one, you have the universal maxims, and these are the maxims that every one of us should know. These universal maxims are known as the five universals, al-kulliyat al-khams. The five universal legal maxims that everyone should know, one of which is this hadith, la darar wa la dirar, or the sub-maxims that are extracted from this hadith. That is one of the five universal maxims that every Muslim should know. There are certain maxims specific to the legal theory of a particular school of law. So you will have qawa'id fiqhiyya that are the exclusive domain of the Maliki school or the Hanafi school, principles and legal maxims in the Hanbali school that look at the legal foundations of that school and the maxims that are derived in that school to help them arrive at accurate answers to questions of Islamic law that are understood in light of the principles of that school. And then you have legal maxims that are differed over, and this is also discussed in many of the more detailed books. You have maxims of a variety of manners in which they describe different levels of intricacy in Islamic law. What's important for us as lay Muslims is to understand the five universal maxims. And this hadith forms the basis for one of those five universal maxims, and that is there is to be no harm or reciprocating harm. Let's look at some examples of this. There are principles and sub-maxims that are derived from this hadith. One of them is the principle ad-darar yuzal, and this is actually the wording for one of the five universal maxims. Harm must be removed. We derive from this hadith the prohibition of there being harm or reciprocal harm, that harm should be removed. And this implies a number of things important for us. Number one, it implies that we have to identify the harms in society and the harms in our life. Only by identifying them can you make an effort to remove them. Number two, we have to identify and reach out to victims of harm, victims of oppression and injustice. And number three, because harm must be removed, we err on the side of caution when we determine the harm. What this means is the person who is experiencing harm doesn't necessarily have to prove the severity of the harm they suffered for them to have that harm removed. We should err on the side of removing harm. This is the basis of this sub-maxim, ad-darar yuzal, harm must be removed. Another principle or sub-maxim derived from this hadith is harm should not be removed by harm. Because the hadith says there is to be no harm or reciprocal harm. If there's already a harm and one tries to remove that harm with the reciprocal harm, then they have violated the prohibition contained in this hadith in the words of the Prophet ﷺ. We understand from this hadith, therefore, that harm is not to be removed by harm. A good example you'll find in the books of law, or the books of legal maxims, when they give examples for these, they give the example of a person who has a property and the property is flooded with a large body of water. That's a harm to your property. You're not allowed to drain that water so that it goes onto your neighbor's property, because though it is a harm you're experiencing, you're not allowed to reciprocate the harm or bring it to someone else just because you suffered it. So you can't drain that water in your property so that it goes into the property of your neighbor, causing them harm. Another example they give for this principle is the prohibition of cannibalism. Cannibalism is haram because the harm of hunger, is not removed by the harm of eating another human being. And another example they give is that if someone was to capture you, Allah forbid, and hold you captive and threaten to take your life unless you kill someone else. So imagine, Allah forbid, a person is kidnapped and someone puts a gun to their head and says, if you don't kill this person, I'm going to kill you. If someone says that, is that victim allowed to kill another person to save their own life? They're not, because the principle is harm is not to be removed by another harm. La darar wa la dirar. You're not allowed to value your life over the life of someone else in that situation. If you experience the harm of being killed in that situation, may Allah protect you and all of us, that is a harm that affects you only. You're not allowed to harm someone else in that situation. There are some exceptions to this. The exception to this maxim would be the harms that are specifically outlined in the Sharia, and that refers to the hudud punishments in a situation where those conditions are met, in that circumstance and society where those things are carried out, obviously. The harm that is afflicted in carrying out the hudud punishment, it is a harm. Nevertheless, it is textually stated and is obligated in Sharia. Therefore, it's an exception to this general principle. Another principle that we derive from this hadith is that the greater harm should be removed by the lesser harm. This concept of lesser of two evils. We affirm that concept in Islam, that if you have two evils, the lesser of two evils is applied to remove the greater of the two evils. Some of the examples for this include divorce. We know that divorce is one of the most detested things among permissible things in the sight of Allah Ta'ala, and it is a harm in that sense. However, it's often the lesser of two evils. If a person is facing an abusive situation in a marriage, it is a lesser harm for them to get divorced and leave than it is to remain in that relationship and suffer abuse. Other situations where it is more harmful to remain in the marriage than it is to get divorced. Other examples would include eating pork if you're out somewhere starving to death. Eating enough pork to sustain your life, not having a full meal of it. This is allowed because the harm of dying is greater than the harm of eating that swine, eating the khinzir. Another example they give is praying salat if a person is naked because they were robbed of all of their belongings by a highway robber. You'll see a lot of examples like this in the older books of law, where they talk about highway robbers and people praying in the nude because they don't have clothes. That's because in the pre-modern period, clothing was a lot more expensive than it is today. So if a person is traveling in a caravan and they're robbed by a brigand, those brigands would often steal the clothes as well as the money and other items. So what do you do if you're in that situation? If a person is completely unclothed because they were robbed of everything they have, they still have to pray. So they either are missing the prayer or they are praying but unclothed. Missing the prayer, the obligatory prayer, is a greater evil than praying unclothed, because that is a situation that is beyond your control. You have a shar'i excuse, and in terms of how to pray, that's in that situation, there's details in the books of law. If a person is to pray in a group, how that's done, it's an interesting study of what to do in the situation, but that's a harm, and one would pray unclothed rather than miss the prayer, because you remove the greater harm by the lesser harm. Other examples for this: to remove the greater harm by the lesser harm, taking the lesser of two evils, they say throwing money overboard a ship that is sinking. If you're traveling and you're in a boat and it got hit by a storm, or you hit a rock and it's sinking, it's a shipwreck, you're about to go overboard and drown. Maybe the only way to save that ship is to throw heavy things overboard. And those heavy things would include gold and silver and very expensive items. Destroying wealth is a harm. This is a harm. But saving life is more important than saving wealth. The harm of destroying wealth is lesser than the harm of destroying human life. So one throws the wealth overboard to save life, even if getting rid of that money is still a harm. So we take the lesser of two evils. If a woman is deceased and she's pregnant, we don't mutilate bodies in Islam. It's not allowed. But there are certain situations where it could be allowed. One of them would be if a woman had died and she's pregnant, to cut open the deceased woman to save the life of her baby in the womb. You could think of other examples. If a person is on the roof of a building and they're threatened with death if they don't jump off the roof. Now, there's two scenarios here. They don't jump and they get killed, or they jump off and they have a reasonable expectation that they're going to break their ankles and break their legs, but they'll survive. According to the maxim, you will be allowed to jump over or jump off that roof, even if it breaks your legs, to save your life, according to the maxim, because that is a harm, but not as great a harm as being killed. So this is a sub-maxim that derives from the hadith, la darar wa la dirar. Another maxim derived from the hadith is removing harms takes precedence over obtaining benefits. Meaning, if you have the two situations here, you either gain benefit or you obtain harm, right? Which one takes precedence, removing the harm or getting a benefit? Removing the harm takes precedence over getting a benefit. The Prophet ﷺ says that whatever I forbid you from, abstain from it. And whatever I command you to do it as much as you're able. So if you have this choice to make between preventing or removing harm or obtaining a benefit, precedence is given to the removal of the harm over gaining the benefit. An example would be, let's suppose you really like barbecue. You like to have cookouts. So you get this brilliant idea that you're going to build a huge barbecue in your backyard. Let's say the barbecue is a 50-foot by 50-foot massive barbecue. You can put entire cows inside for this massive barbecue. In that process, you're gathering all this firewood, you're building the fire inside of the barbecue, and you're cooking it. And as a result, the smoke is so much that it pours over into your neighbor's house and damages their lungs, and they have breathing issues now because of all the smoke from your barbecue. Now, do you stand to benefit from your nice large barbecue? Of course. Maybe you like barbecue. Maybe you want to open a business and sell the barbecue. This scenario sounds a little silly, but it gets you thinking about how this works. That's a benefit for you, but it's not a benefit for your neighbor. It's a harm for your neighbor. They now have breathing issues. They now have asthma. They now have problems because of all this massive amounts of smoke coming from your barbecue. So who gets the right here? What takes precedence? You having a nice barbecue or them being healthy? Them being healthy. So we would not be allowed to build that massive barbecue if it results in discernible harm to our neighbors. Another example would be, the ulama mentioned this one. I find it very interesting. They say that an example of this principle in action, where removing harm takes precedence over obtaining benefits, is intentionally reciting the verses of prostration in salat, lest it confuses someone who walks in and joins late. That's an interesting example. A person who walks into the masjid late, as the Imam is reciting, some of the ulama say that the Imam should not seek out to recite those verses of sajda. They should recite them. If they happen to be reciting the surah that has a verse of sajda, they recite it. And when the verse of sajda comes, they make the sajda of tilawa and they get back up. But they don't seek out those verses or sets of verses, because there's a possibility that a person's going to come in late, and as he's walking in, they're in sajda, and it gets confused. So they'll say the Imam should avoid doing that, because although he may feel it benefits him because he gets to make extra sajda, it is a harm to that person who is now confused in their prayer. There are exceptions to this. Removing harm takes precedence over obtaining benefits. However, there are some exceptions to that, because the Prophet ﷺ says that it is permissible for a person to tell what we call white lies, to make peace between warring parties. He also says, ﷺ, that it is permissible for a spouse to tell little white lies to keep the peace with the spouse. The husband can say, "This is your best cooking ever, darling," even if he doesn't enjoy the meal, because removing the harm in that situation takes precedence over him saying exactly what he feels about the meal. This is an example of an exception to that maxim. So this is just a sample of some of the legal maxims that are derived from this prophetic hadith. La darar wa la dirar. There's to be no harm or reciprocating harm. We are, as Muslims, we are default conservative. I don't mean that in a political sense, in the Republican Democrat sense. I mean in terms of our moral values and the guidelines for how we organize society in our family life and public life. We are conservative in that we want to conserve what is there, and we don't jump into things without knowing the consequences and realizing what are the long-term effects, because the preservation of what you have takes precedence over gains or possible gains that are speculative. And removing harm takes precedence over obtaining benefits, especially when those benefits are speculative. So this also guides our moral principles and how we respond to new issues. We always want to be careful and err on the side of caution. As we see, this hadith is very profound, because though it is so brief in its wording, it applies to so much in our Islamic law and principles that govern our ethics and morals and interactions with each other. Wallahu Rasulu A'lam, wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.